This is Donna Jones, and you are listening to the Caretakers Journey podcast.
Welcome. I'm your host, Carole Leathem, and I am so excited and a little bit nervous about our conversation today. We're going to be talking about healthy conflict. And as a caretaker, that is one of the number one contributing factors to the stress and the issues of caretakers burnout right now. And I have a friend, Donna Jones, who's recently written a book called Healthy Conflict, Peaceful Life. And I'm excited to introduce her and what she has to say about healthy conflict to you as my listeners. Now, Donna's a national speaker. She's a pastor's wife. She's a self-described Bible explainer. I love that. She's spoken in 26 states and on 4 continents. And the thing that I love most about Donna is that her desire is to mentor and disciple women in their relationships with the Lord. Donna's passionate about equipping others to know, love, and follow God in their real, everyday lives. And she lives in Southern California with her husband, JP. They have 3 children and 5 grandchildren. And I just want to welcome you to the show, Donna.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here with you.
Thank you. Well, as we dive into the idea of healthy conflict, I know that when we're looking at the life of a caretaker, in fact, I got a call a couple of weeks ago from a caretaker whose husband is struggling with dementia. And she was just at her wit's end because his dementia is causing some acting out in some aggressive behaviors and verbalizations. And so she was just trying to figure out how to continue loving and caring for this guy, even though he is still somewhere inside, but he's locked with this dementia and it's creating just so much stress for her. And I started to think about your book, Healthy Conflict, Peaceful Life. And I think a lot of the things that you have learned and talk about in your book can carry over. So let's talk about healthy conflict. So how did you come upon this idea and this subject?
Yeah, well, interestingly, I never set out to write a book on conflict. I mean, because who would?
Yeah.
But yeah. I set out to write a book on how to have healthier relationships. And then in the process, I realized the reason that most of us struggle in any area in our relationships usually has something to do with the conflict involved.
Yeah.
And here's the thing about conflict, Carole, that I know, every person listening knows, is that when we are struggling with conflict with someone, it literally impacts every part of who we are. I mean, we just can't get away from it. We think about it in the shower. We talk about it with our friends. We replay what happened over and over in our minds, and it's just all consuming. Which is why it's so important to know how to deal with it in a healthy way, so that number one, we can feel good about the way we handle conflict, that it's God honoring. And then number 2, so that we can actually get some peace in our life, which, is why the book's called Healthy Conflict, Peaceful Life. Because, sometimes, especially when we're dealing with someone like, say, with dementia, there's very little peace coming from that side, right? So we have to know how to figure it out on our side.
Absolutely. And I think in some ways it gets really confusing because when you're taking care of a loved one and the stress of the conflict comes in, because conflict comes from their anger, it comes from aggression. It can come from our fear of not knowing how to deal with it. It comes from mood swings. There's an anxiety there. And so it's interesting to me, when my husband first started struggling with his mental illness, I dealt with a lot of conflict. And I had to figure out how to listen but not hear. I had to figure out how to deal with the things that he was saying. And I know we've talked before personally about you going through this with your mother-in-law. You and your husband have just recently had to go through some situations with your mother-in-law as she was struggling with her health at the very towards the end of her life. So talk to me a little bit, or, share with our listeners just a little bit about some of the things that you have in your book, some of the qualities or some of the things that you can share with us about the conflict, dealing with the conflict.
Yeah. And I want to piggyback on something that you said. because conflict does come from maybe the person that we're caretaking. If they have some sort of, the anger is coming out at you, but it can also come from someone that we are not maybe full-time caretaking, but maybe part-time, like an older parent. And it's just for them, it's the loss of independence, or it's the grieving of their youth or whatever. And then that kind of can play out in our relationship with them and cause conflict.
Yes.
Conflict can happen with, other family members who are supposed to be helping us caretake and maybe don't do their fair share.
Absolutely.
Or we maybe have a sibling that's doing most of the work, and we're wondering, like, why are they doing it that way? I mean, there's just the way this can manifest is 1,000 ways. So back
so
to
where so where would you jump off at like a starting point for helping us?
Yeah, well, I would say to take one conflict at a time.
Yes.
Honestly, because what ends up happening is we let things build and build and build and build and build. And then the weight gets so heavy. We either completely explode, maybe on the person that is coming at us, or, we fall prey to what's called displaced anger. And that's where maybe an elderly parent or a spouse is being really difficult. And we don't want to take it out on them because we think, well, they have dementia or they don't know what they're doing. But we have all this pent up emotion. And so we ended up taking this out on those that are closest to us that really aren't the source of the problem. So, that's why taking one thing at a time is really
taking your conflict
helpful.
I like that.
Yeah.
I really like that. I like that because it's easy to start like almost like opening up and just piling it all on. And then for me, I remember early on when my husband began to struggle, it was hard for me then to separate. It was hard for me to figure out, how to take it one at a time, because I think if you start just kind of like almost like putting more weight, and then it's really hard because once you put it on, then how do you get it off? And I woke up one day and I just felt this heaviness. And it wasn't that anything had changed. It was just that I kept piling things on. And the breaking point for me was I realized that the doctors and the nurses in my husband's care group were telling me the same thing. Just keep him alive, because my husband struggled with the idea of suicide. And so they would say to me, just keep him alive, just keep him alive, just keep him alive just keep him alive until we can find the right medication, until we can get this. And so I had put on this mantle of just keep him alive. And that was the pressure, that final pressure. I realized that morning that that was something I couldn't do. Yeah. And it freaked me out. But when I realized it was something that I couldn't do, I began to unpack all of the different stresses and say, okay, this is what I can do. This is what I can't do.
Yeah.
Yes. And then, like you said, taking them one at a time. But it's almost like you have to step back and then start identifying what they are, or what the problems are, or what the conflicts are.
Yes. And Carole, that you said two words that are, or two phrases that are, I would say, really key. Number one, you said separate. And number two, you said step back. Because when we are in the midst of caretaking, a lot of times we are the recipients of their displaced anger, right? Yes. So they're mad about something else, or their brain isn't functioning like it once did. And so we are the recipients. Whereas in more peer-to-peer relationships, it's usually conflict is like a little bit of you and a little bit of me,
Yes.
Or as my mom used to say, there's his side, her side, and the right side, right? So it's a little different than when you are in a caretaking situation. So, although we might be contributing, and that we have to look at is the way my lack of boundaries, is that contributing? Is my attitude contributing? Is my lack of know-how contributing? We do have to look at ourselves in terms of what might be actually increasing the conflict rather than decreasing the conflict. But we were talking earlier before we hit record about my mother-in-law. So my husband was the primary caretaker, my husband and myself, for my mother-in-law. She moved to be close to us. And it was interesting because not that we minded, but we were never consulted. We were just informed. So I'm moving close to you because you guys will be the ones that take the best care of me. So, so I was like, okay, here we go. There was no discussion. There was no, how is this going to work? It just was it was. So, and all went well for several years because she had her full faculties mentally, even though she didn't physically. So, and see, there's something different about caring for someone who has their mental faculties, but not their physical faculty. It's just a completely different quality, right?
Yeah, so totally different.
Yeah. So if somebody doesn't have some physical things, then that's exhausting for a caretaker. But it's exhausting physically for a caretaker.
Yes, correct.
Not quite as much emotionally or spiritually or relationally. It is exhausting. But when my mother-in-law then began to get persistent bladder infections, and then for the elderly, that manifests itself in, what's it called? When, I can't think what the word is, when you see things that aren't there.
Hallucinations.
Yes, thank you.
They start to have hallucinations because it's really poisoning their mind.
Yeah, exactly. And then my normally sweet mother-in-law became really foul and cruel and belligerent, and to the point where the last place she was in, they were calling my husband 3 times a day. My husband, he's the senior pastor of this large church. He was like, what? I don't even know. I'm going to get fired from my own church because, and he didn't have any help from his siblings. They lived out of state, and it was kind of like out of sight, out of mind,
Right.
And it was just so heavy. And so I get it. All I'm trying to say is I understand the feelings of being the recipient of the venom that comes from somebody who you're trying to take care of the best you can.
Yeah.
And it's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah. I know when we first moved my mom into an assisted living a year ago, my mom fought because she didn't like the idea of assisted living. She felt like her life was over. She felt like she was being put in a home and she was going to be ignored. And we finally got her in there, and she was in there for about, she was there for about a week, and she was starting to feel comfortable, but she wouldn't let us call it. Like every time the word assisted living came up, she would just overreact, just completely overreact. And so one day I said to her, Mom, are you upset about the word assisted living? Yes. And I said, okay, let's call it something else. Can we just call it something else? What could we call it that wouldn't be offensive to you? And she said, let's just call it housekeeping. And I said, okay, well, that kind of fits because that's one of the jobs they're going to do is come in and clean your house. So we began to refer to it as housekeeping. And over the course of the next 3 or 4 months, she began to call it assisted living. And we saw this shift in her own mind. But part of that was not getting angry at her. Part of it was just saying, why are you struggling? Now, she still has her mental faculties. She has her mental faculties for the most part, she has to be on oxygen. And so there are times when the oxygen deprivation in her brain starts to kind of confuse her and she'll see those hallucinations. But for the most part, it was just understanding what was making her mind kind of trip up there, and communicating, getting her to communicate her thoughts, her feelings, and her opinions. And I think that's hard. And I know when I was looking at your book, you talk about how can we communicate our thoughts, our feelings, our opinions. What are some ways that we can step into a healthy communication for healthy conflict?
Yeah. Well, you actually modeled one of the biggest components of doing this.
Okay.
And really, what I'm about to tell you is going to be a game changer, not only for us as caretakers, but also us as wives and husbands and daughters and parents and friends. And this is the key right here, what I'm going to tell you.
Okay.
Okay. I'm going to tell you the biggest mistake, and then I'm going to tell you the biggest solution.
Okay.
So the biggest mistake is to be dismissive of someone else's concern or opinion or thought or reason that they're upset.
Yeah.
And it's way more common to be dismissive of it than we think it is. Because, if you're like me, Carole, I'm like, I would never be dismissive of somebody's, thoughts. But, when we say things like, they just are saying that because they're old, or they're just saying that because they have, they're kind of losing it. They're getting dementia, or they just say that because, that's being dismissive, right?
Yeah.
Or when we say things like, oh my gosh, again?
Yeah.
Or why are you making such a big deal about this? It's just not that big of a deal, Mom. Get over it. Or it's not that big of a deal, or Jesus wouldn't want us to feel that way. And we spiritualize things, right? Right? We're supposed to give thanks in all circumstances, right? So all of those things are ways that we dismiss someone else's concern. Now, here's why this is particularly lethal. When a person is upset, what they really are looking for is to be understood.
Yeah.
So if we don't listen, then they don't feel understood. Now, here's the problem.
Yeah.
Is that a lot of times we don't listen because we are thinking about what we're going to say before to refute what the person's going to say.
Yes.
Or we think that listening equals agreement. But listening, yeah. And
say
listening
is,
we don't listen because oftentimes we think listening equals agreement. And listening does not equal agreement. Listening equals understanding. Wow. And when someone feels understood, they feel loved. Wow. And when someone feels loved, it opens the door then to work through conflict in a healthier way. So let me tell you.
Go ahead.
Can I just? Okay. Let me tell you what happens in the mind of someone. And actually, this happens in your mind and my mind too. All this is for all of us. Is that when we are expressing something, and the other person is not listening to us, in our minds we think they're not getting it. They're not understanding what I'm trying to say. So I need to ramp it up just a little bit. I need to elevate this conflict, because if I get louder, if I repeat myself over and over again, if I slam the door, if I give the silent treatment, if I ramp it up, if I escalate this, then maybe they'll understand why I feel the way I feel, or think the way I think, or I'm doing what I do, right?
Right.
But if we still don't understand, they keep escalating until they realize she's never going to get it. And then they end. So, and then that you hear people say things like, forget it, you just don't understand. Or,
Correct,
it doesn't even matter. And then we try to get them to open up. Come on, no, tell me. I do want to listen. I do care. Nope, forget it. I'm done. This
Yeah.
conversation's over, right? So it's
Yes.
escalate or end. And
Okay.
so if we will just push pause, which is what you talked about earlier,
Yeah.
separate ourselves just a little bit and just say, hey, you know what? My job right now is just, I need to be a listener, because that's going to communicate understanding. And if I understand, then we can work this through a little bit. And even more importantly, especially if you're dealing with somebody who maybe doesn't have all their faculties, it gives you a piece of what they're thinking or feeling,
Yeah.
so that you better than know how to help them and care for them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And and as you're saying that, I'm remembering that circumstance with my mom and realizing that she was saying a lot of the things that you were saying, and she was trying to escalate and escalate. And so when we backed off, when I kind of pushed pause and said, wait a minute, let's talk about this. The other thing that I discovered is that she felt like moving into this apartment complex, she was losing her identity. She was losing her independence.
Yeah.
So one of the other things that we did, which we discovered was really, really, my sister and I tag team on her care. We discovered that we created a corporation. Not really, but in my mom's mind, we created a corporation. And we called it the Dottie Odell, that's my mom, the Dottie Odell Corporation. And my mom is the CEO of her life. Okay, so she is the one who runs her life. Now, a CEO needs employees to help them. So I became the chief financial officer because I take care of all of her money. I manage all of her bills. I keep track of all her, different things. My sister stepped in and became the chief medical operations person because she handles all the doctor's appointments and that type of thing. And when we created the corporation, then we would say to my mom, now, you are the CEO, but in order for you to be a good CEO, you have to listen to the financial officer when she says, okay, you can't spend that money because we need this. And then you have to listen to the medical officer when she says, okay, you have this appointment. You need to take this medication because this will help you and your doctors, and we're all working together. So it kind of created this feeling of, okay, we are working together for you to have the best and most independent life that you can have. And we don't have conflicts very often at all, and so I think it has helped.
There we go.
I did.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay.
So if you're listening to this, we're having some little technology demons today, but we're going to push through this. I discovered that the communication, like you were talking about, was so key, and just pulling her in.
Well, and you just illustrated another key component of dealing with conflict. See, this is why you're the host of the podcast, because whether or not you know it, you're actually doing so many things right. You and your mom and your sister approached conflict from the lens of being collaborators. Now, in the book, I talk about there's 6 primary conflict styles. And actually, on my website, you can take a quiz to find out what's your primary conflict style. And then you can also find out, like, maybe what, let's say, your sibling's conflict style is, or, if you're working with your sibling. The conflict style that is the healthiest in terms of resolving conflict well is the collaborator, where everybody, they're coming at this from, like, let's see if we can make this a win for you and a win for me, and let's all work together, right? And that's different than the compromiser. Yeah. The compromiser is, let's give in and lose a little part of ourselves, which is a collaborator. Collaborator is, let's not lose a part of ourselves. Right. Let's work together so it's a win for everything. So you collaborated and you gave your mom the feeling of power.
So as we start winding down the show today, is there another
meeting in order to function well?
Oh, that's so good. That's so good. So as we start winding down the show today, is there another little nugget from your book that you can share with us? Or maybe we've talked about the mistakes, we've talked about, your personality and the way you do it, but is there one last thing that you'd like to leave us with about how we can have healthy conflict in a peaceful life?
Yeah, well, I think there's two things that go hand in hand. And one of the things that I learned really the hard way, Carole, in dealing with conflict is that truthfully, I'm just going to be really vulnerable. I would sometimes just pray, okay, God, change them. Make this easier, change them, right? And I think, why won't you change this person? It would be so much easier if you would change this person. But, we can't change another person. We can only change ourselves.
Uh-huh.
And that would be the piece of the puzzle that I had to learn, is that
Yes.
I was praying the wrong prayer. And instead I needed to say, Lord, I need you to change me. Help change me. And that brings up the second piece of the puzzle, and that takes humility.
Oh.
And I think when we're caring for someone else, humility and dependence upon the Lord is what's going to carry us through. And that doesn't mean we don't have boundaries. That doesn't mean we don't seek wisdom. That doesn't mean we don't care for ourselves, because all of those things are really important. But looking to change ourselves versus changing someone else, I think is key.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Donna, thank you so much for this conversation. Where can the listeners get in touch with you?
Yeah. Well, they can find the quiz that I was talking about, where they can determine their conflict style. And then you'll get like a little 2-minute video from me telling you what your conflict style is, the pros and the cons of that conflict style, and one thing that you can do to move forward to be healthier in the way you deal with conflict. That's on my website at donnajones.org. And then you can find the book, Healthy Conflict, Peaceful Life. It's on Audible, Kindle, paperback. It's everywhere books are sold. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, ChristianBooks.com, everywhere that books are sold.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Now, as we close out, I always like to ask the same question to all of my guests, because I'm huge on self-care, because we have to take care of ourselves or we cannot take care of anyone else. So, Miss Donna Jones, what are you going to do in the next 24 hours to take care of you?
Oh, well, I was going to say something spiritual, because I read my Bible and I journal every morning. That I find is huge. But truthfully, Carole, I'm getting a well-deserved facial later on this afternoon.
Yes, I love it.
It's not something I do all the time, but I do have a facial scheduled for today. So there you go.
Wow. Well, there you go. See, I'm big on self-care. I just believe that we have to do those special things to take care of ourselves. It makes us stronger.
Yeah.
So if you would like to know more about my Caretaker's journey, you can find the link to my book. Are You Ready to Find Joy When Life Gets Messy? In the show notes. You can also find a link to all of Donna's contact information, her website, her book, in the show notes as well. And we'll be back next week with another meaningful conversation about the Caretaker's journey. And until then, it's all about Him.